sport. There are coaches who sit at one end of the spectrum who are very holistic. They adapt, they develop, and they do what is necessary to meet the needs of the person in front of them. And then you have other people who go, this is my way of coaching. And that's fine. But I think often, especially when you look at athletes that have become parents, gone through injury journeys, potentially broke through, look at like Emma Radikal, like she's done an amazing job, but actually that young lady, by the time she's 21 compared to the 14-year-old, is going to be vastly different. And actually, and not criticizing the coach, is the coach that was with her when she was 14 the same coach that she'll be with when she's 21? Who knows? But then if you look at, and again, I can only see it from like Adam's insight, but actually when you look at that, what you've seen is a coach that has grown and developed with the athlete, and the athletes had to grow and develop as well. There's always that kind of, facing off and the arguments, like any relationship, but actually they have grown as a twosome. And if you look at the most successful athletes out there in any sport, Bolt was with that coach the whole way through his career. If you look at Michael Jordan, all the way through his professional career with the same coach, there are coaches who have got that ability to adapt and develop and grow with their athletes, and there are those that don't. And I'm not saying that's the sole reason. Some people like to move around the world and get, especially in certain sports. If you're in golf, probably not going to spend too long in the UK. And then in other sports, it's not as much of an issue. But I do think there's a huge human journey element, and occasionally that means that actually the people need to change around them.
Yeah, I just think it feels a bit cheap when you hear something in the news that someone's dumped their coach and they're moving to someone else. And it's like, to me, if I was an athlete, it'd be a friend and I'd feel a bit betrayed. But I don't know. It is an interesting one. I totally understand what you're saying. It is.
Oh, it's hugely controversial.
Yeah.
If you go the other way, from a coach's point of view, it's hugely controversial when athletes often move on, especially when they're younger, because they're obviously guided by their parents, who might be, suffer from like the magpie effect, where somebody's dangling something sparkly over here and it's a scholarship here, or it's in my sport, 50-meter pool over here, or whatever it is. And actually, they're not necessarily understanding whether it's in the best interest of that individual human being. And I think that's a real challenge. And I think a lot of coaches struggle with that. But I think what happens there, certainly in my sport, is what you're dealing with is a mass amateurism approach. You have not got a professional structure. Whereas if Cristiano Ronaldo decides he's going to go and have a visit with Bayern Munich, there's a channel that it goes through, and it's all done professionally. It can't be done like on the sly. Whereas I know people that have, won national titles or put swimmers on international teams, and then a week later get told, oh, they're off here or they're off there. And you think, do you understand what that's done to the coach? So I see it from the other side. From an athlete point of view, it's huge. And obviously, as I said, they grow with their coach as a person. But from the coach's point of view, who's dealing maybe with that 10 times over, 20 times over, or 30 times over in a year, can be a real emotional stress for them. And I think that comes back for me to the amateuristic approach of a lot of sports in the UK. It's how it is.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I suppose one of the other reasons I asked that question is I watched the film King Richard because I'm into films, and I talked with someone about the Oscars and that, and watched King Richard with Will Smith, who won the Oscar. We won't say anything about that. But that was an interesting story. Have you seen the film yet?
No, but I'm familiar with the story pretty well.
So the story where the coach, and he said, no, I'll coach him, and that kind of thing. So that sort of got me interested. Now, another thing I wanted to ask you was, and this always interests me, is mental health. Because I remember a while back hearing about football academies where you've got young kids growing up, and they get somewhere like Chelsea say, we'll have you when they're 14, and that's it. That's their life. They are training with Chelsea. They get educated with Chelsea. They're 14, 15, 16. They're teenagers, 17. Thinking this, seeing all the stars. Maybe they get a few games, and then either they get injured or they get told they're not good enough. So they've lived their life as a teenager, as a child at this place. Chelsea. I'm not saying they do this, but I'm just saying. And then all of a sudden, you're thrown out, or you are left. You've left. That mental health wise on a child, that's pretty powerful, isn't it? And I think that can relate to other sports. What's your thoughts on that?
So I think sport has a lot to answer for. In the sense of, when I go back to this professionalism structure, could you imagine being in a what I would consider a mainstream job nowadays with a company that's got more than 200 staff, and that mental health aspect isn't not even appreciated at all? Whereas if you actually look at most governing bodies, they have hundreds of staff, depending on what sport it is. And actually, is that, a piece of legislation that the government are saying every single kid should have mental health support? Now, I'm biased because I come from a world of being very aware of mental health.
Yeah.
I've done some work linking up mental health providers with sports clubs, so I've seen firsthand the value added.
Yeah.
But the other thing for me that I really find baffling is for the lot, and quite rightfully so, I have to say, but quite rightfully so, we have for many years obsessed over the importance of caring for the physical health of young people, like quite rightly so.
Yeah.
And yet mental health almost feels like the cherry on the cake as opposed to 50% of the cake. And I think it doesn't matter if a child's not overtrained, if they're mentally suffering, like that's just as much of an issue. And I'm quite outspoken on it, because there is no excuse for me. Like, the resources exist out there, the platforms exist, NHSX and stuff like that with their digital platforms. You've got so many services through Mind and other platforms that exist. And, I've got to a point now where actually I'm kind of taking up the mantle a little bit. Like, I've done some work with Adam's team, and we've got a coaching mental health and wellbeing platform for coaches. The organization that provide that, they then are rolling that out to actual clubs themselves. So it provides stuff for the athletes. And I think that shouldn't, change often comes from within, but it shouldn't. That should be a piece of legislation that, is at government level, all sports, all clubs. If you are a governing body affiliated program, you must have a mental health support platform within your programs, because we all insist that the coaches are qualified and they understand physical training and technical training and tactical training. And yet we go, we're not really sure about mental health. And you're like, what? It's probably like the biggest thing. Like, if you go, think of it as a parent, your kids come out of a football game. Did you have fun? The first thing you ask them, what was your experience? And 90% of their experience is going to be in their head. If they've had a negative experience, it might be, someone said something to me, or someone shouted at me, or I perceive this, or I'm worried about that. And yet it's not top of the agenda. So I'm a big advocate for more mental health support, but I do think change is on the way.
Yeah, I think, and it's like you said, it has been in the past reactive. Something's gone wrong, and then they've brought in a mental, and it shouldn't be like that, because the pressures, you think, these kids, I use football as an example because it's such a big sport, and you can see these superstars in these cars and having everything you wanted. It must be soul destroying. So a club, I keep saying Chelsea, but a big club like that, they could have 4 or 5 mental health. There's no reason not to, and I don't know, maybe they do. But I do think it's definitely something that's very important, isn't it?
It's the danger as well is that ultimately sport generally, the clamoring of oversubscribed people to get to, the highest levels. At the end of the day, for every one person that pops out the top of the Premier League system, you're looking at maybe 5,000, 10,000 kids that don't. And whilst that's the case, it's supply and demand. And that sounds awful, because the byproduct is poor mental health. But ultimately, whilst 1,000 people are knocking on the door every 5 minutes, 1 or 2 that are worth 10, 20 million quid need to pop out the other end. And from a business point of view, that's all. And I'm not saying that's all they're worried about, because that's an unfair statement. I know a lot of sports teams are doing a great job with it.
But what I am saying, part of the equation.
Yeah, it's part of the equation. And the ultimate thing for me is that then you get to a point where children feel, and they are children, if they're under the age of 18, they are children, feel like they are a number. And that, when you talk about an experience, that's horrendous to get to that point.
Yeah. So where's the future then? You're doing that many things, Kevin. What's the future look like for you and your company and coaching? And Jesus, it sounds like you don't have time in the day to do anything.
No, and I'm working like an absolute nutter at the moment to try and save for a house. And as soon as I've got my house, I want to spend more time on my podcasting. So I do a lot around sharing quite unusual stories. So, I've spent time with like the captain of the Red Arrows and people like that.
Wow,
and actually, like, the kind of things you learn from that you then kind of go, right, that allows me to do so many other things better. And actually what it also does is it broadens your insights into people that have made it, not, and I say to the top, not necessarily literally, but they have made it to a successful point in their careers. You actually start to join the dots between a successful author, a successful fighter pilot, a successful footballer, a successful swimmer, you know, whoever it is. And I think that for me is getting to the point where actually I can spend more time helping with that. And also the mental health thing is huge. Like for me, if over the next 5 years, I could see change to a point, and the way I view sport generally is if you fix stuff for the coaches, it has a roll down effect. So, you know, in my sport, there's 50, 60,000 kids. There might be 1,000 or 2,000 coaches. So in terms of time to get to impact, it's going to be a lot quicker to get to 2,000 coaches. So I don't know how we get to this, but I would love to see it get to a point in sport specifically where there is legislation in place that supports coaches, mental health, well-being, professionalization of those systems. So you're not having amateur management, you're not having volunteer management of, and not criticizing it, but it's just a system the way it is. But you get people who, you know, during the pandemic, for example, were told, oh, we can't pay you. And you're like, what? It's like, oh, well, you're on kind of this contract that's not really done properly. And you're like, what? That's mad. They've got a mortgage and kids like everybody else. So I think that if I could look back in 5 years' time to this point here, what I'd like to have seen happen is legislation around mental health, coach professionalization. And then for me, selfishly, like my own personal stuff, just like doing more podcasting and then sharing those messages, what that looks like. Well,
the thing is, and I've spoke to a few people about that on the podcast before, because it's a great avenue where me and you can have a chat for an hour. We haven't got to travel, you know, because sometimes traveling is difficult and when you're running out of time, and we can highlight these things and put them on a social media, and, you know, a few people might see them, a lot of people might see them, but it's getting the conversation out there, which is the most important thing. Whereas years ago, you know, we'd have had to go to a conference to meet and go to, you know, and talk to someone else. And it's a great way of communicating, isn't it? It's good.
It's changing things massively. And I think, you know, the way we connected, if you look on that platform there, the volume of people on there, if you just search like 2 search terms like sports and something else, you'll come up with 1,000 results. And actually what it's doing is that you're starting to get almost like a village of people that are all kind of singing off the same hymn sheet. And I think that's really nice now to, you know, we were talking before we started recording about my microphone, to be able to go on YouTube and go, tell me how to set up a professional microphone. Tell me how to get the best out of it. Yeah. And they go, right, if you've got this mic, you need this bit of kit, and you need that, and you need that, and you need that. And all these little tips. Like I'm going to a podcasting conference next month, which I need to send you actually. Yeah. It's down in London.
Send me any tips. Give me any tips.
I think it's like 300 presenters are going to be there. And like, you're thinking this is going to be absolutely awesome. And then there's a live podcast from Fern Cotton in the evening, who runs one of the most successful podcasts in the country. Wow. And I look at stuff like that. And again, you know, go back in the day, you wouldn't have had stuff like that going on. You might have had an audio conference once a year from a very niche group of people who worked in the sound industry, but you certainly wouldn't have had people from all these different backgrounds and walks of life, and part-timers and full-timers and volunteers, all of that coming together and going, inspire me, share some information. So I think that's really exciting going forwards. And hey, I think after the last 2 years of being stuck at home, I think people are like, what do you enjoy? Let's do something that excites you. Let's do, even if it's in your own time, evenings and weekends, do something that gets you up and about and actually wanting to be engaged in the world. So yeah, we shall see.
I always ask my guests for the best bit of advice they've ever been given, or maybe you've given to somebody. Have you thought of anything, advice?
Two things that stick out for me. My coach, ironically, of course, it was my coach. My coach when I was younger, I went off to a university program then when I was 21. So I was quite late into like senior sport, if you like. And I remember going back after the first 3 months, like broken, because I jumped from about 5 hours training a week to about 20. And I was ruined. And I saw him at Christmas, and he wrote down on a little Post-it note, Rome wasn't built in a day. And he gave it to me, and I stuck it next to my bed at university as like, just stop whining, basically. It's going to take a while. And it took me 4 years to get to where like my best, if you like. But that was one thing. And the second thing And this is more like, I guess, life and philosophically, that life isn't a rehearsal. And when your time eventually comes, look back and say that I didn't waste my time and lived kind of everything to its fullest, but also true to who I am. And like, this, like, it's kind of quite heartbreaking, but like, my dad passed away 3 years ago, and
Oh,
he quite sadly got cancer, but went sideways. But at the end of his time, that when they stopped treatment, he said to me on the phone, that was the last thing he said to me when it was like, this is it, we're stopping treatment. He said, I've done everything I want to do. I couldn't have asked for any more. And you're like, when you hear that from someone who's
yeah,
acknowledged the fact that they've got weeks to live, you actually go, crap, this is it. This is literally it. Like, and at some point, whether that's when we're 21 or whether that's when we're hundreds, that time will come. So I think that's certainly a
yeah,
philosophy that I carry forwards, of just do it. And we talk about like sport inspiring people to get off their backsides and try something. Don't wait, because at some point you'll look back and be like, and I want to come to that time, whenever it is, and look back and go, that was awesome. I'm
yeah,
glad I tried that. And I might have failed miserably at
yeah,
100 things, but I had a go. And I think
yeah.
that would be my closing message to everyone out
Yeah,
there, is just have a
that's
go.